Thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tom ter Voort. I work for Bureau Veritas Cybersecurity as a pen tester and security specialist. And I'm going to talk about OPC UA. First, I'll give a brief outline about what this protocol actually is. Talk about the cryptography being used within the protocol and two vulnerabilities that I found and how these can be exploited, followed by some conclusions. So OPC UA is a general communication protocol for industrial automation. It's used in all kinds of industries for all kinds of purposes to make ICS SCADA systems, PLCs, and so on communicate with each other. And unlike a lot of other protocols in this space, it's not proprietary, but an open standardized protocol that is supported by multiple vendors. It can interoperate, and it's also not based on a half-a-century-old serial protocol. But what I personally found really interesting about it is that it has security features. And thanks to these security features, transport encryption and authentication, the protocol is kind of known by a lot of users of it, that you can actually expose it across trust boundaries, unlike a lot of other OT protocols that you really want to keep in a separated off network segments. Especially if you have like things in the field, let's say a windmill somewhere that you want to control centrally or monitor from a central location, it can be very convenient to be able to set up a connection to it over the internet, for example. And due to OPC UA's security features and encryption features, it's even popularly used in a variety of use cases without having to set up a VPN, and that's seen as a big advantage of this protocol. So that led me to take a look at how this cryptographic protocol actually works. And in general, it's based on two different layers: the communication layer, or the secure channel layer, that's responsible for setting up transport encryption, and for client and server authentication, which is basically the device authentication, which is what you would typically use when you have an automated system connecting. Then there's the session layer, or the application layer, which takes care of user authentication and authorization, which is generally used when you have somebody, for example, using an HMI, is directly interacting with the system, entering a password somewhere. And you can use both authentication methods, neither. You can turn encryption off or on. You can also use a mode that just uses cryptographic integrity protection, but not actual encryption. And when you do use the client and server authentication features, the trust model is based on certificates. Typically, in many implementations, when a client connects to a server, the first time the connection will be rejected because the certificate is untrusted, and then an administrator on the server side can look at a list of rejected certificates and indicate that they actually do want to trust the certificate. So kind of a pretty pragmatic trust on first use solution. But there's also different setups based on PKIs or just full pre-configuration available as well. So this first layer, this secure channel layer, starts off with a pretty typical cryptographic handshake. The client knows in advance what the certificate of the server is with the included public key. It knows what kind of cryptographic suites it supports. This is either pre-configured or obtained through a discovery protocol. That's out of the scope of this talk. And then the client will open up the connection by generating a random nonce value, signing it with its own private key, and encrypting it with the public key of the server. It sends this to the server, and the server also responds with a signed and encrypted message containing its own nonce. Both nonce values are then fed to a key derivation function, and then both sides can derive symmetric session keys for the follow-up communication. The protocol supports a variety of different so-called security policies, which is a set of low-level ciphers to use during these protocols. In practice, the ones that are currently implemented the most are all basically variations on RSA and AES. After this first secure channel handshake, the client and server will move on to establish a session, which is required every time, even when you don't use user authentication. In this protocol, the previously derived keys are used to encrypt every single message and also authenticate them using a pretty standard AES, CBC, and HMAC construction. The client will generate a random challenge value and send it to the server. The server will prove its identity by signing this challenge and then generating a new challenge that the client has to sign. Client signs that challenge, and then the authentication is complete. Optionally, the client can also add authentication information from an end user using a variety of means. And then if this all succeeds, both sides know, okay, this particular session that uses this particular session key has been authenticated. What's noteworthy about this, from a performance perspective, the combination of these two steps is not a very efficient protocol, because both sides, they do 3 expensive RSA decrypt or sign operations, while if you want mutual authentication and key exchange based on RSA, you really would only need to do that once. But of course, the fact that this is a bit inefficient doesn't mean that the protocol is insecure, and having these multiple layers may actually make it more difficult to attack. So something that caught my eye about this second step of the protocol, this session handshake you just saw, is that the way that the client and the server send each other's challenges is done by taking that value, concatenating it with the other side's certificate value, and then signing that. But that method is basically exactly the same for both directions. They don't include any context metadata that says this is a message intended originating from the server intended for the client, or going from the client to the server. And that is a little bit problematic, because there's many use cases in OPC UA where a system can act as both a client and a server, and there they generally use the exact same certificates. So you can use the same public key to sign messages going in either direction, but these messages are structured in exactly the same way. So in theory, that opens up a potential signing oracle attack, where you can basically swap these types of messages around and trick a server to sign something different than it actually should be signing. So the first theoretical attack I came up with was a relay attack, where you have 2 different servers that trust each other, server A and server B. And how the attack would work, the attacker connects to server A, and it says, my identity is server B. It takes the certificates it has discovered from server B and provides a challenge. The server A signs it and then provides its own challenge that the attacker then has to sign. But instead of signing it themselves, which they can't do because they don't know the private key, they then set up a connection to server B, copy over the challenge that they got from server A, and they ask server B to sign that challenge, where the attacker pretends to be server A as in a client role instead of a server role. Server B will provide this value. Once they've done that, the attacker cuts off the connection with server B, plugs that value into the message to server A, and they should have bypassed this authentication step. But actually, you really don't even need 2 servers, because in many implementations, by default, a server trusts its own certificate, and then you can just do basically the same thing, but do it with the exact same server. So the attacker tries to log into server A and pretends to be server A, which is surprisingly actually allowed. They then set up a second connection to the same server, let it sign its own challenge, cut off that second connection, proceed with the first one, and they have bypassed this whole session authentication step. But this is where these redundant RSA operations come in, We may have technically bypassed the authentication protocol in this second layer, but we still have this first layer, this secure channel, where we need to decrypt something with our own private key, and we need to sign something with our private key, but the attacker in this circumstance doesn't have the private key, so shouldn't be able to do this operation, so they shouldn't be able to derive a correct symmetric key, so they can't even make a valid message that could be used in this protocol. So how do we bypass this? It turns out that there's a relatively simple way to bypass this, and that is by using a variation of the protocol. By default, OPC UA is a binary protocol used directly over TCP, but there is an optional variation that's tunneled over server-authenticated HTTPS. And because HTTPS already offers transport encryption, the protocol designer said, okay, well, now we can actually skip this handshake because the whole TLS layer will take care of that. However, the problem with that is that this handshake implicitly already authenticates the client because the client has to do stuff with their private key. But when you have server-authenticated HTTPS, the server authenticates itself, but the client does not. So when you use OPC UA over HTTPS, you're completely reliant on this session layer authentication, and that's exactly what we've just bypassed. So I implemented this attack for this protocol variation, made a tool, and it totally worked. You just give it an HTTPS enabled OPC server, and the tool will immediately bypass authentication by doing a reflection attack, or if you have two servers, doing a relay attack. And the server will spill all its secrets, basically, gives you complete access. Now, this is already would be pretty severe if it were not for the fact that not really many users in practice actually use this HTTPS protocol variation. There's very little adoption of this protocol. It's relatively new. Most people just use the TCP variant. Of course, there's a number of implementations that actually open up the HTTPS version of the protocol by default, and if you don't firewall off that port, this attack will still be relevant even if it's never used in practice. But still, the impact is pretty limited because the HTTPS variant is simply not used a lot. So what would be a lot more interesting is to attack the more common variants and go after OPC UA over TCP. And my approach there was to take advantage of one of the supported cipher suites, which is based on RSA using the PKCS V1 padding scheme, which has basically been definitively broken by Daniel Bleichenbacher back in 1998. But for some reason, a lot of protocol designers since didn't get the memo and still kept using this particular RSA padding scheme. So it may be worthwhile to see if we can actually exploit these well-known vulnerabilities in the context of OPC UA. Only problem though, this padding scheme, or at least the cipher suite that uses this padding scheme, has been deprecated by the OPC Foundation. And implementers are recommended to still implement support for it, but to turn it off by default. So yeah, what would be the point in trying to attack a deprecated feature? Well, a lot of implementations don't really follow this notice and turn it on by default anyway. Also, there can be users that use a configuration that was set up before this deprecation, and probably not many vendors are going to issue a patch that will break previous configurations, so then they will still support the cipher. Also very interesting is that there's a variety of implementations that do not offer this method by default, but when it is explicitly disabled, they will only check that it's disabled after they have already tried to decrypt a message using the protocol. So I try to send this encrypted message using this vulnerable scheme. Server tries to decrypt it and then decides like, oh wait, actually I'm not supposed to use this, I'm going to block the connection. But at this point they already did a decryption, which already enables the attack. And also interesting is that if you even have one single server that supports this protocol, you can actually use the attack to target other systems that may never use it and may have turned it off because they already use a more secure RSA padding scheme. So a quick, very simplified primer on Bleichtenbacher's attack. RSA encryption is basically just modular exponentiation of a large integer. And the whole point of RSA padding is to turn a sequence of bytes, your message, into a large integer. And the way this scheme does it is by prepending a 0 byte, a 2 bytes, bunch of random bytes, 0, and then your actual data to make sure you get a very big number and you don't just have something like the number 1 in your message that will stay the same if you exponentiate it. And then after the server decrypts it, it checks this padding and removes this padding to get the original message. And if you're an attacker and you can see that the server fails to remove this padding, the server gives like an error or something that indicates padding has failed, this gives you a little bit of information about the message that your ciphertext represents. Because if padding fails, it apparently does not conform to this format. If it does not fail, it must match this format, which implies that this number that's encrypted must be apparently greater than a number that starts with 02, but smaller than a number that starts with 03. So if you have a secret encrypted RSA value that you don't know, you can take advantage of homomorphic properties of RSA to basically multiply known values with the ciphertext and get like as a result the multiplication of the secret and the value that you choose. And by picking a lot of specifically chosen values and observing, is the padding okay or is it not okay, every time you get like a result that says the padding is valid, a little bit of information is leaked. And when you do this in a clever way, you can eventually, slowly, bit by bit, decrypt the entire message. Just narrow it down after about like 1 million queries, which is why this attack is also sometimes known as the million message attack. So how would we use this against OPC UA? Well, there's 2 different operations that we need to bypass involving an RSA private key. There is signing of the initial message, and there is, once you've done that, you still need to decrypt the message that you get back to get the nonce that's in there. Well, decryption is straightforward, but you can also use Bleichtenbacher's attack to spoof signatures, because RSA signing is really basically just boils down to RSA decryption of a hash value. You can use the exact same technique more or less to spoof signatures. So what you would do is you would start doing this Bleichtenbacher attack until you've spoofed a signature on some message, including some nonce you picked. You send out this message, you get back an encrypted response, then do the attack again to decrypt that response. This first stage, once you've spoofed one signature, you can just keep reusing that signature, so you only really have to do that first step once. The second step is a little bit trickier, because while you're doing the attack, you do have to keep your original connection open, because the moment that connection closes, the nonces are no longer valid and no longer useful. So how you do that in practice is you basically just keep sending TCP keep alive messages on one connection to keep that one open, and you use different connections to do the Bleichtenbacher attack. And of course, to make this work in practice, you still need a padding oracle. You need a way to distinguish valid padding from invalid padding. For some implementations, this is very easy, because they simply give a different error message. If the padding is wrong, you can see a certain type of error code, a certain type of string occurring in the error message. And if the padding is right, this is somewhat different. And then you can trivially distinguish the 2 cases, and you can basically implement the standard attack without too much trouble. But unfortunately, most implementations that I tested show exactly identical error messages, regardless if the padding check failed or whether the padding passed, but after unpadding, the message was invalid because the signature was invalid. So the other way you could exploit this attack is by exploiting a timing-based side channel. Basically, try to time the difference between correct padding and incorrect padding. And that is something that actually at first sounded very hard to me and probably very impractical, or at least something that would involve like making sure you don't have too much network jitter, do a lot of more extra tests that take a long time, you use statistical techniques to filter out false positives. It just sounds very hard to do a timing attack like this. But it's good to keep in mind that not all timing attacks are hard. If you have the traditional SQL injection that includes a sleep statement, that's a very easy timing attack because the timing differences, you can influence them and you can make them really big. And you can kind of do something similar in the OPC UA protocol. Because the way they do RSA encryption uses a little bit of a strange structure. It's kind of RSA operating in a kind of ECB modes, you know, from block ciphers, where if the message is too long to fit into a single RSA block, which in practice it always is because the message also includes a signature that's the same size, so it's usually 2 blocks in size. They just split up these message blocks and encrypt every block individually. This is really not how you should be using RSA. This is a very strange structure that even though it will have very different properties than if you use ECB for block ciphers, you actually could use this mechanism with RSA to encrypt your penguin pictures, but you do open up a lot of theoretical like chosen ciphertext attacks. But what's the property about the scheme that I could abuse is that you can take one of these guesses for your Bleikenbacher attack and just repeat this ciphertext that you make to do the attack with and repeat it 100 times. Then you send this long message to the server. The server, if the padding of your guess is wrong, the server tries to decrypt the first message, sees the padding is wrong, throws an exception, stops processing. But if the padding of the first message is correct, it will proceed to decrypt the second block. Well, you're repeating the same block, so it will also be correct. So it will decrypt all these 100 blocks. And RSA decryption is a very expensive operation. And then only after these 100 decryptions, it will notice the message is wrong and it will fail. And this results in a pretty sizable timing difference. You can actually tweak a little bit how long you want to make the messages. It depends a bit on the server what their message limit is. And of course, if your messages are shorter, you can carry out the attack a little bit faster. But in this case, for example, you can see you repeat the ciphertext 100 times. Your timer, the order of magnitude of the timing differences is like in tenths of seconds. This is a really big timing difference. And to take advantage of this, I really didn't have to do any fancy statistical methods other than if I see something that takes a little longer, maybe repeat it a few times to weed out false positives. But it is really, really easy to actually time this. So I just took the standard Bleikenbacher attack. Instead of looking the differences between error messages, I would do some relatively simple timing. I would, if the timing would be short, under a certain threshold, which actually happens for by far the majority of the cases, because during the Bleikenbacher attack, by far the majority of your messages have invalid padding. Then I know, okay, I'm going to assume padding is invalid. But if processing suddenly takes a lot longer, I'm going to consider this to be valid padding. And return that to the implementation of the algorithm and say, okay, padding is correct in this case. And this sounds like it would be a very slow attack, but because like 99% of the messages that you're sending are actually the fast case, and it's only those relatively rare cases with correct padding that take long timing, this attack really is not that much slower than using the error-based oracle, surprisingly enough. So I put all of this in my tool. And I added a nice little progress bar with a spinning bar in it and numbers that keep going higher that you can stare at while the tool is doing its work. Well, after a few seconds, the number is slowly going up. It's going up a little bit further, and then the tool has passed the first phase. It has successfully spoofed the signature. So it stores this signature in a file, so if the second phase fails, you can reuse it. And then it just tries to do the it sends the message with the spoofed signature, gets a reply, keeps the connection open, and then it tries to do the attack again to decrypt the message it received back from the server. And it works. I could point this at the server, and I could bypass the client authentication step once again. And in this example, as you can see with the little stopwatch, it only took 15 minutes. Now, to be fair, this is a relatively fast case. This was an implementation that had a pretty efficient implementation written in C. So this was a bit faster than other implementations. The other implementations I tested, this attack would take like around like 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Worst case was like 2 hours. And of course, it was a bit in a lab setup with not too much network jitter. Although I also tried it by just hosting a VM. It was still in the same country, but in general, the attack would actually work. Sometimes it's just a little bit slower than otherwise. And for the attacker, well, if your attack takes 15 minutes, 2 hours, doesn't really matter. There's a difference between having to take a coffee during the attack or maybe going out for lunch. And from the defender's perspective, what I also found is that this attack, it kind of takes place in the very first step of the handshake, and a lot of servers, they don't actually log any cryptographic failures in this phase. So if you would go take a look at your log, this was not always the case, as I had one implementation where the whole log would be filled up with all kinds of weird errors, which may draw some attention or fill up the log. But in most cases, the attack was practically invisible. You didn't see anything about it on the other hand. So yeah, if you're an attacker, you probably won't mind taking a little time for this. So this does, of course, still depend on like the peculiarities of individual implementations. These are protocol flaws. But if it works or not does depend on a few details and on the configurations. What I found, I tested 7 different OPC UA implementations. 2 of them were not vulnerable at all to both attacks, but 5 of them were. And of those 5, 4 out of those 5 were vulnerable to either one or the other attack in their default configuration. So if you would use the default secure configuration that uses client authentication, you would be vulnerable. All of this does assume that your setup only uses the client-server authentication mechanism. If you have user authentication, if you have a password in there, my attacks are not going to help you guessing the password. So if you just use password authentication, these attacks are not relevant. But if you use the certificate-based authentication, which is a sensible setup, if you have like an automated system setting up this connection, then this could potentially result in an authentication bypass. And well, if I picked these 7 implementations because that's where I could get like a lab setup working in a reasonable time, and they didn't require like expensive hardware or software licenses. But there's many more implementations, and if 5 out of 7 in this sample were vulnerable, you can probably extrapolate that and say that a lot more other implementations would be vulnerable to this same attack. And after disclosure, I saw like several notices from like CodeSys and a lot of Siemens products, like the WinCC server, that implemented like patches for these vulnerabilities and even gave them relatively high CVSS scores. So from that, I assumed that they were probably vulnerable in common configurations as well. So, well, I found some protocol bugs. Well, sort of, it depends a little, protocol bugs that behave a little bit differently per implementation. That sounds, of course, like a complete pain to disclose, having to go to all these different vendors, and there's all these other vendors out there I didn't even test. But luckily, there's the OPC Foundation that like curates the standards, and they basically have like their members basically encompass almost all the implementers of the protocol. They have all these vendors already coming together in this foundation, and they actually have like a very nice system where security vulnerabilities can be disclosed directly to the foundation instead of having to go to like Process, to like Siemens and so on, one by one. So I disclosed to them. They replied basically in like 1 hour and invited me over in a call with foundation members on the very same day. So that's a very nice and fast response. That's a little bit differently than what I'm used to. And they basically did all the hard work of coordinating these vulnerabilities to all these different vendors, getting all these different vendors to, well, first figure out what to actually do about these kinds of tricky issues, and getting them to implement patches on a relatively short time frame, which is really impressive, and really my compliments to the foundation for doing this. A number of CVEs were issued. What can be a little bit confusing is that some vendors, they use their own CVE, or some use the existing CVE, but depending on the software product, they actually have different CVSS scores, whether you use one or the other, so that's something to pay attention to. And the types of fixes that they used, well, some simply included like, okay, nobody uses the HTTPS feature, we're just going to completely turn it off and make it inaccessible. Some included like workarounds to make the padding oracle attack impossible, and also altering the documentation or like warnings in the software, hey, please don't use this RSA method, or changing like the defaults. It kind of depends, it changes from vendor to vendor how this was solved. And it's pretty important if you run like OPC UA and use client authentication, that you check your vendor documentation and advisories to see if you need to do anything about this. If you don't use the certificate-based authentication, or you don't rely on it, you probably don't have to worry about this. If you do, and you're not really sure if your vendor has completely mitigated the issue, you can probably fix the issues by turning off the HTTPS feature and turning off the legacy RSA cipher. But there are still implementations where this was not enough, because they would still try to decrypt something with the legacy RSA padding, even though it was turned off. So that's also why I made the exploitation and testing tool available publicly. You can find it here, and it will also be published in the white paper that's on the Black Hat website, that you can use to evaluate your OPC server and see, after you applied patches, for example, if it's still vulnerable to these attacks, and test if these attacks work in practice, if you want. I only tested it against the 7 different implementations I listed before, but I'm pretty confident that since it worked on these 7 different implementations, it should probably work on others as well. Although the error-based padding oracle attack may not work, because it's the way error messages differ per implementation. Could be different than I expected them to be. So what can we learn from this? Well, in general, designing cryptographic protocols is hard. You may be using secure building blocks like AES, HMAC, RSA, but putting them together in the right way in a protocol is very tricky. And there are all kinds of tools that can help you with this, like formal methods, but it really is a specialized job, and it's hard to get right, which is well evidenced here by these kinds of subtle protocol flaws that where the way that messages are signed, the order in which they are signed, opens up like a pretty severe vulnerability. Also, always good to keep noticing that Bleikenbacher's attack still works in practice. It was possible against TLS for a long time. It was possible against JSON Web Tokens. People just keep implementing PKCS1 padding, and I would really call on all protocol designers, or please stop doing this. Just consider this as completely broken. Don't think your use case is special or not vulnerable. This attack is, even though it may be called a million messages attack, well, I just showed an example of where I pull it off in 15 minutes. That's really not as impractical as hard as it may sound to be. And yeah, because yeah, you kind of saw like some design flaws in the protocol, like, well, these vulnerabilities, these inefficiencies. There's some really, the odd way they used RSA. Based on this, I personally didn't find other vulnerabilities, although I didn't explore all facets of this yet. I don't think we can rule out that similar vulnerabilities like this will crop up in the future. So that's something that we should probably take into account, that these kinds of crypto flaws may crop up again. So does that mean that we cannot expose this across a trust boundary anymore? Do we always need to tunnel OPC UA over VPNs? I mean, I probably wouldn't go that far. It depends a bit on your threat model. I would definitely recommend, if you have internet exposed servers, to also use IP allow listing. So if you would actually have like a severe authentication bypass or a pre-auth vulnerability, that also have been there have been plenty of examples of those in the past. You really don't want to expose that to everyone directly. So at the very least, use IP allow listing. And then you're probably good at most use cases as long as you can rapidly patch your server when one of these vulnerabilities pops up. If you're in a situation where you can't do frequent patching or you really want a higher level of certainty, then maybe it is indeed a good idea to still tunnel over VPNs. But that will kind of depend on your individual threat model. And yeah, that was my talk. We still have about 4.5 minutes left, I see. If anyone would like to ask some questions, you can move to the microphones here, or you can join me to the rep area around the corner here. And yeah, thank you all for attending.
I have a question, but I'm sort of slightly biased because the systems I've seen are sort of mines in the middle of Africa that are also critical to our cobalt supply and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think, and like sort of those, as much as those CVEs are going to be published and updated, they're not going to update their systems. So you've got sort of part of our critical supply lines that are basically under the control of very small InfoSec teams that are not, like it's one of the big problems with, in general, control systems. Do you think like there needs to be more work towards sort of potentially moving these control systems to more sort of centralized, like if you expose a vulnerability in the NVIDIA GPU Docker loader, then like all the vendors, they just sort of update their packages and so on. But like this doesn't happen in this critical physical infrastructure layer. So I was wondering if you have had thoughts about like, does there need to be more regulation? Does there need to be like, what is the solution to ensure the sort of critically understaffed people that are maintaining all of these things really are not reading these CVEs?
Yeah, this is a very common problem in this whole space. Yeah, there's probably not going to be an easy solution. In practice, what happens, you throw it all like on your network segmentation because we can't patch these systems, we can't follow all these rapid changes. We just try to reduce our exposure so that no attacker will be able to reach us and be in a position to exploit anything. Yeah, the unfortunate situation is that yeah, a lot of control systems, they indeed people don't have the resources or budgets to do things like rapid patching, or actually doing so is far too risky for operations. And yeah, then really what you've got left is just trying to reduce that attack surface, trying to focus on physical access controls, network segmentation, using those VPNs if you really need to operate like something remotely. And that's kind of your best bet. It's kind of assume if my attacker has like a network level vantage point to reach this device, we're just going to assume that we can be breached in that case, which is often also the case in practice. And then we're going, yeah, and then we have to build our controls kind of around that. And only if we want to use like the security features of OPC, that's really more appropriate if you're in a context where you can do rapid patching, where you can do, where you can operate more as like a, well, more like a more typical modern IT firm than the traditional way of approaching like these control systems. But yeah, I would indeed say that this is, in practice, this is pretty tricky. Yeah.
I mean, so you could scan the internet and you can sort of find critical vulnerabilities and you can say, actually, given your IT infrastructure, it's illegal for you to run your water plant like that.
Don't put it on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like that becomes sort of an offense. So I think that, as much as we say, oh, you can't do it, there would be ways of implementing.
Yes, absolutely. From like a regular, that would be like a very straightforward. No, not the, but an important requirement would be, well, don't put this on the internet.
If it's on the internet, do you have the appropriate controls in place for rapid patching?
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't have it, you need other controls. Yeah.
I don't know if we still have time. I was
10
wondering
seconds.
if you looked into the implementation of the OAEP schemes in terms of Menger's attack, like RSA with the other betting scheme. Did you look into attacking those, for example, with Menger?
Yes. So of course, OAEP itself, well, it's basically secure enough against like padding oracle-like attacks, but because they use it in this weird like ECP-like structure, in theory that opens up like kind of chosen ciphertext attacks where I have like a message I don't know, but I like append like the message that I encrypted myself, so I can like mix up my chosen plain text with the unknown secret plain text and try to or change the length of my message and try to somehow trick it into revealing its contents. I could actually not get that to work in practice because the messages were like signed. And all the implementations I tested would validate that signature in a way that it didn't really reveal any other information about the message. So that really didn't get any further than theory. But maybe in some implementations, attacks like these may actually be possible. But I could not get that to work anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And I think the time has run out. So if anyone else has questions, you can join me to the rep area. Thank you.